John last night that I just typed fast.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Sorry, we are a little bit late this evening, 2 or 3 minutes late. These things happen, little technical glitches, people having to download apps that they already have. But we're here to talk with two experts on China about, not China, but about America, and particularly reimagining America. So I wanted to start. What happened was last week on Tuesday, we had quite a good show. It was very popular, had a lot of views. And then we went into kind of after show chat for another hour or so. And I thought, well, hey, why are we wasting this? Let's make some notes out of these conversations and bring them back next week. So John Pang and Warwick Powell, thank you very much for rejoining me to reimagine the United States. I want to go, first of all, if I may, to you, Warwick, to say there was one comment you made. There are some things that make the US administration uncomfortable. Let's go straight to that. What makes American or the American administration uncomfortable?
The idea that the United States is no longer the exceptional, indispensable hegemon is probably the one thing that makes the administration incredibly uncomfortable. And I think it manifests itself in two very particular ways. One is on the global stage, of course, where for the best part of the last 30 years, the United States has very much seen itself as the Leviathan, if you will, that delivered peace and prosperity across the globe wherever it went. If you haven't picked up, there is a modicum of sarcasm in my tone when I say that. But I think it also has a domestic dimension as well, and that is that the promises of the American dream that has, I think, given so much energy to that nation and the people within it over a couple of centuries and a bit has begun to run out of puff, and and that makes the administration uncomfortable as well, because the gap between the promise and the reality seems to be getting wider for an increasing proportion of people in the United States.
What do you think, John? Do you agree? Is there more that makes the administration feel uncomfortable from your perspective?
I certainly agree, and the psychological dimension of it is of course not to be underestimated, but I think it's also there's the psychological and cultural question among the American elite, the presumption of a certain preeminence, leadership, or supremacy, exceptionalism. These are very hard to get over, but there could possibly also be a structural dimension. I think Warwick mentioned, this is where it connects to the domestic dimension that we just touched upon, and actually we touched upon in our discussion last week. That is that it's of course related to domestic management. Although it's overwhelmingly clear that U.S. empire and its imperial activities have not in the main benefited the American public, the domestic polity, at least not in an equitable way. There may be a sense in which it's the system is sustained on this, or at least people feel that it is. So if we look at the dollar dominance, for example, that could that's certainly a rather concrete, a rather clear aspect of this. That is, how much of how much is it actually dependent on this dominance, and how much will it lose domestically from losing that supremacy. So that discomfort could also be from a sense that we've built this structure that we live on, and that if we lose it, it's going to be unthinkable. It's going to be very destructive of the economy and the political order. So that would be an interesting, place to branch off our discussion.
Yeah, I think it probably would be. Southside Mike has come up with this and says, my videos, and this is true, they rarely, if ever, address what he thinks is the real root cause of the anti-Chinese policies, both military, economic, etc. He believes that's a deep-seated white Western racism. And I just said to him, well, I'll bring this up and see if you guys agree. Both of you are kind of from different parts of the world. All three of us are from different parts of the world. Personally, I don't see it as being white Western racism, but I'm not an American. What do you guys think? Warwick?
Race is never very far away from American political culture, from the very early days, whether it's the race relations between the colonial settlers and the Native American Indian population, which was subjected to what has been described as the worst genocide that history has actually ever seen.
Right.
Race has also been a cornerstone feature of America's relationships with the black community, going back to the days of slavery and the slave trade, of course, but it actually continues to permeate the political culture and the economic structures of America today. And insofar as Asia is concerned, and China in particular, race has never been very far away either. And it's not a recent phenomenon. It's something that has historic antecedents. So again, a bit like Australia during the gold rush days in the United States in the latter half of the 1800s, there's significant anti-Chinese sentiment from many sections of the prevailing white settler community in America. So much so that the United States eventually, through at federal level, introduced the Chinese Exclusion Act, specifically targeting Chinese to be excluded from the United States. So the idea of China being a difficult proposition, if you will, from a racial point of view, is not a new one in the United States, and I would suggest that in fact what we're seeing today does draw deeply from this wellspring of anti-Chinese sentiment in a very specific sense, but also a deeply racialized political discourse in a broader, more general sense.
Right. John, as a Malaysian, how do you view this?
Very much the way Warwick described it. If I sometimes don't bring up race or hesitate to talk about white supremacy, it's only because I don't want to be misheard. Of course, it antagonizes people, especially people who think they're white and feel sort of targeted by this. But as if I was talking about something that was merely bias or merely psychological again. So I think Warwick touched on this. It's really deep, and it's. I'm interested again in race as a dimension of the colonial political economy of the United States as a settler colony, but also of Britain as empire. So it played a fundamental ideological role. And in this, I'm talking about race as a sort of construct. I don't just mean people with white skins or with not enough melanin, but as an ideological construct and the construction of white people, of a white race, so to speak, or of whiteness. This is a big issue, and if you haven't spent a lot of time in the United States or perhaps Australia, you don't quite get it. So growing up in Malaysia, you're actually not aware of this. Because there in Southeast Asia, you do have issues of race, but on a different order. I would say it's more like ethnic strife, bigotry. Race as a construct, as almost a geopolitical construct, is much more than that. You almost, you really don't know the depth of it unless you've spent time in the US and taken time to understand the role it plays in the culture and in the political economy.
Yeah.
So you have very early on the identification of the native, the Indian, if you will, as the other, and as a subhuman to be exterminated, right? So you have the beginnings of this kind of doctrine of race there, and then afterwards a certain group of people whom it is legal to exploit and own and to enslave. So these were fundamental for several hundred years, even before the formation of the United States of America. It was a slave economy.
Yeah,
it was a settler
a
colonial
genocidal slave economy.
It was a genocidal slave economy. It's too horrible to mention, and it's often difficult in polite company and polite discussions to bring it up, especially as I look like this, for example, right? It looks like sort of special pleading. Yeah, so maybe it's easy for you to bring up. I don't know, but it's as if the discussion became a kind of just mudslinging and name calling. I don't mean it in that sense at all.
Right.
And the sense in which I mean it actually is emerging now, such that, for example, again, you see in Gaza, for example, a group of people who are killable, so to speak. They really are. This is a group of people whom it is legitimate to slaughter. A whole lot of people feel that for particular reasons, and their race has a lot to do with that. And again, that construct is built on top of a kind of power structure. It wasn't there before.
Yeah,
it wasn't there.
Well,
before.
Neither was Israel. If we go back to 1946,
exactly.
It wasn't there before either.
Was Israel. So these matters get complicated, and it's this abstraction. So in the United States, you have people who are, English, Irish, Germans, French, whatever, coming over here, and all of a sudden they're white, because this was a white settler empire.
Yeah.
There was a political category.
So that's interesting.
You have these fundamental color things, right? You have black, you have red. So you have the Indian, you have black, and I want to say the yellow, the Chinese, is another fundamental one that's often overlooked in the history of race in the United States, also in other settler colonies like Australia. Now, the yellow, as opposed to the black, the red is the one that you want to exterminate. You want as few of them there as possible. You don't actually need them. They're no good for labor. The black, you actually want them to multiply. And that's why you have this one-drop rule and so on. You want more of them because they are wealth. Most of the wealth in the country, was embedded in the capital was human capital in that horrific sense. But the Chinese is another kind of, and the yellow is another set of political characterizations, and these are emerging in today's sort of China-US discourse. Again, they're hard to talk about if you think we're just talking about psychological stuff and I'm just talking about whitey there. It isn't that, but it's emerging in a very clear way, in the way in which, for example, you hear US leaders talk about China and permit themselves to talk about China and characterize it as a threat.
What's really interesting from the comments you've just made, it just made me think of something. And what I'm thinking is really interesting there is that the blacks were slaves. They were assets. The Chinese were not wanted in a great way, but they were actually paid for. They were a cost. They came across to mine for gold. They came across to build the railways. And the things that they did cost the United States, whereas the slaves were an asset. I know there's a cost.
They're not the asset. The Chinese are the ones that you want for their labor, but you don't want them sticking around. So I think a lot of people are not aware that, immigration law in the US began with the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yeah.
Immigration law worldwide, actually. Yeah, exactly. It began with the attempt to define these people as an other, and they are not permitted to migrate. So you have this problem. You have a country in which you encourage white migration, you discourage people further from Eastern Europe a little bit, right? Southern Italians and Jews, but you definitely don't want the Chinese, but you want their labor, and their labor is fundamental. In a lot of places, they replace the blacks, the freed blacks. right? In the Caribbean, for example, after emancipation, you had a whole lot of Chinese labor come in, and they did the labor of the black. So that the yellow category is, you're supposed to serve us. You're not supposed to make trouble, of course. You're a subcategory. You're of course below, but you have a particular economic function. Now, going back to China, I don't want this to get, I want to, I want to say that this is relevant. It's okay so long as you're assembling toys and so on for them, right? You are fulfilling that expectation of your category. And once you start to talk back, and once you start to do stuff that, it's supposed to be for sort of the civilized world, white, whatever. There's all these other ways of talking about it, from the garden people to the rules based and so on. There's a way of demarcating, and the rise of China is a huge offense to that. It's very uncomfortable, to go back to your first question.
So, Warwick, you look like you were just about to add something. You looked anxious to get in on that.
Look, there's actually a very interesting history in terms of how the sense of otherness has been constructed, particularly in the context of European colonialism and the greater project of liberalism. So liberalism, or at least a certain part of liberalism, was very much about a way in which civilization was understood, and that revolved around a very particular way of constructing a notion of a civilized person and a kind of person that one needed to be civilized within a civilized society. In liberalism, the kind of person that one needed to be able to be a civilized person in a civilized society was one capable of autonomous thought. And that was distinguished from the uncivilized or the barbaric, which was seen to be a person that was caught up in the moods of a crowd, that would be easily led by culture, custom, and those sorts of things, as opposed to being able to exercise the individual faculties of reason. So liberalism goes through all of this, from Locke all the way through to Mill, as well as a range of colonial administrators who worked in Egypt and other parts of the world, very much framing the problem of population governance, if you will, through a lens that determined what constituted civilized and what didn't. And it was actually used as a way of rationalizing the need for external governance in India, for example, over a native population that was deemed to be uncivilized. Now, this history, this intellectual history, if you will, goes back hundreds of years. It goes back 300-400 years, and it is one of the unsavory sides, if you will, of the Western Enlightenment. And it underpinned at an intellectual level and rationalized the colonial violence that was exacted upon other peoples around the world. The other part of liberalism was actually, so liberalism was often seen as a very secular thing, non-religious. And yet liberalism dovetailed quite nicely into a spiritual warfare program that came along for the ride, if you will, and often led the ride. So liberalism as a mode of governance supported and aided and abetted a spiritual warfare mission to also bring civilization to the barbarians. And that was framed through the lenses of a religiosity and Christianity in particular. So much so that come the early to mid 1800s, the perspective from the European and American powers was that the spiritual war that had been waged across the world through various waves of colonialization had only two places left to conquer. One was the Middle East and one was China.
Right.
And and so by the middle of the 1800s, in the context of China, we started to see waves of particularly Protestant missionaries come to China with a view to saving the Chinese souls. So look, I think, I mean, so that to me is a way in which the political culture, if you will, of a place and the political economy has been framed. So I'm sort of less interested in talking about China today, I guess, and a little bit more interested in thinking
well,
about.
it was an interesting question to take us off topic. Sorry about that.
But it actually helps us understand.
I don't think it's off topic if we're talking about reimagining America.
True.
Yeah, it helps us understand the nature of or a particular part of the Constitution of America, if you will. What makes America America,
and the foundational problems,
and how it relates to others, and how it defines others within its sort of political philosophy or political theology, is actually critical to understanding its conduct and behaviours today.
Well, I'm glad that we did tackle it then. Let's go back to what makes America uncomfortable, because I've been out all afternoon. I mentioned this earlier. I've been out seeing my local Rosas, and Fernando's just popped this up, and I haven't seen this. BRICS today announced the new gold-based currency. I don't know anything about this. This is the first I've seen of this, because I have been out and I've not been online, not only for trade, but for personal use. Is this something or like an add-on to Enbridge, or is this something that BRICS is doing completely separated? Warren, go first. This is your topic, I think.
Yeah, look, I saw a couple of reports around this today, but I actually haven't seen anything directly from any of the BRICS countries or the Russians who are chairing BRICS this year. So there have been a few stories over the course of the last couple of months about a BRICS currency, usually as part of a broader narrative about the return of the gold standard. But I'd be a little bit cautious about diving onto this report without seeing a lot more confirmation, if you will. And the reason I say that is that the decision made by the BRICS finance ministers and the BRICS leaders last year in South Africa was specifically focused on the development of a national currency-based payment system that would facilitate the settlement of cross-border trade amongst BRICS members using national currencies. The conscious decision made at the time was to actually not go down the path of a single BRICS currency as part of this phase of work. Now, that's not to say that there aren't member states or sections of the policy apparatuses in member states that aren't thinking about this idea of a BRICS currency. And much of this discussion has actually come from Russian representatives and Russian think tanks and research academics who have been a little bit more gung-ho when it comes to the question of a BRICS currency. I don't see any of the other main BRICS member states at this stage diving into the idea of an alternative currency. But I'm happy to be proven wrong if these stories actually end up becoming validated reports. And look, part of the thing that fuels these rumours is the build-up of gold reserves by China and Russia, for example. And it gets a lot of tongues wagging as to what is happening. I don't think BRICS, and again, if the reports are the reports and they're validated, then what I'm about to say will be wrong. But my sense is that the BRICS countries are unlikely to make such a big announcement until the leaders meet in Russia in October this year.
I expected it last year, to be quite honest, and I was kind of disappointed it didn't happen. But in retrospect, I see that we're kind of not quite ready for it yet. I think China needs to build up its diversifications in terms of its trade before it goes that way.
Look, I'll just say a couple of other quick things before, without wanting to hog things too much, John. I hope you don't mind. The issue about a currency for the purposes of cross-border trade is really about something that can function as a numeraire, which is a means by which trading parties, in this case, enterprises of two different nations that use different currencies to conduct their own domestic affairs, need to be able to exchange in reasonably stable terms what we would call value equivalents. So, so the idea of a numeraire is a practical matter. But interestingly, a numeraire could actually function really as a bank-to-bank settlement back-end piece of mathematics, really, without it necessarily having to be a new currency per se. A numeraire is literally an exchange mechanism to enable equivalence to be realized in the processes of a transaction. So, I'll just say that I'm a little bit cautious about taking on board these reports. As I said, I saw them earlier today as well, and it's not the first time this year that these kinds of reports have hit the airwaves, though I suspect that it is a little bit premature.
Okay. John, do you know anything about it?
Yeah, I agree with what Warwick has said about this. I think at least in a long interim, the likely outcome or solution would be a multi-currency system with back-end clearing. So this is practically possible now. So there's I don't see a very pressing reason to have the dollar replaced by another sort of global currency,
a digital reserve currency.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on from that then. We're reimagining the United States. Warwick, you came up with a brilliant idea last week when we were chatting, and I thought I loved it. You said China should make the US pay for some of its stuff in RMB. Do you reckon that would fly?
Well, I guess I said it partly in jest, but it's also about trying to think seriously about the issues at stake. And some of the issues at stake relate to the persistent imbalances that exist between the United States and China in terms of its trade account. But it also goes to issues around the imbalances that exist globally in the financial system, which is the preponderance of the US dollar and the way in which the United States finances its trade deficit through the issuance of US dollar denominated treasuries. So, I guess if we're interested in actually resolving problems, then addressing these various imbalances seems to me to be critical issues that should be on the agenda, and on the agenda not through sort of shrill commentary such as overcapacity and those sorts of things, but much more constructive engagements that actually address the issues of capacity distribution and why it is that China has over the last 30 odd years developed a significant industrial capacity, whereas the United States hasn't. And why is it that today the United States feels that it desperately needs to have some kind of its own domestic manufacturing renaissance? And what are the issues involved in actually achieving that? Now, contemporary manufacturing is increasingly sophisticated, dependent on high technology, is data rich, and requires an ecosystem of highly skilled and knowledgeable human workers. This comprehensive ecosystem isn't just a problem for one enterprise. It's actually how one enterprise connects with all the other enterprises up and down the supply chain to be able to deliver an end outcome with least cost and highest speed possible. The United States clearly has, over the last 30 to 40 years, hollowed out many of the features of such an industrial ecosystem. So much so that efforts to rejuvenate one, such as the development of new microprocessor chip fabs in Arizona,
Hmm.
or even battery factories with significant subsidies to other Asian companies coming in to North America. It's very difficult because the efforts to do that are confronting real impediments. The first impediment is that the cost of building a factory in America is about 40% higher today than it was 3 years ago. That's
Right.
impediment number one. The second impediment is energy costs, so electricity costs for running these factories, and reliability of the American electricity network, bearing in mind that the US state and national grids are actually very, very old, and there are significant reliability challenges in parts of the country. The third thing is the availability of appropriately skilled and motivated workers. And a recent report in relation to the TSMC fabs in Arizona
Yeah.
suggests that one of the biggest impediments to those fabs coming online and on time, and they're not on time, they've already been delayed, is a work culture difference between the working ethos of Taiwanese workers in Taiwanese plants and what American workers bring to the table. The other interesting one in all of this is the hollowing out of capability, broadly speaking, from an engineering and design point of view. And you see that in the case of Boeing, where Boeing progressively outsourced just about everything, and it lost control over quality of its supply chain as financialization became the domineering modus operandi of these enterprises. So the overarching thing, I mean, I've described a lot of micro stuff or ecosystem problems with hollowing out of industry and manufacturing, but the reason why that's happened is because finance capital has become the most dominant branch of capital in the American political economy, and dictates terms in terms of where capital goes. Now, the data shows that fixed capital formation in the US is very, very poor compared to what it was 30 odd years ago. Its investments in machinery is low. It doesn't manufacture a lot of its intermediate goods. It imports them from China. So to build a factory in America, you actually need to import a whole bunch of machinery from China in the first place. And in terms of where capital has gone, it's actually gone into your classic fictitious capital markets, which is your stock exchanges in particular, and to a lesser extent into the real estate market, whether it was residential real estate, particularly prior to the financial crisis in 2008, or more recently channeling huge amounts of liquidity into the commercial real estate market, which has now caused the emergence of what is shaping up to be a fairly serious crisis. I mean, these are real problems, right? So if you want to start tackling them, then I think countries can have real conversations about it. But if the idea of America paying for a few things with RMB helps catalyze a serious discussion, then that's probably a good thing for everyone concerned.
Yeah, I think it would. John, you're something of an expert on open source. So I'm going to move the topic here. I've been trying to, I'm no expert on technology. I am your original Luddite, to be honest. So I've been trying to find out a little bit about open source. And I believe there's a thing called GitHub and a thing called GitHe. And GitHe is the Chinese version of GitHub, if I've got this right. GitHub is where all of the tech companies can basically store all of the open source projects that are around the world, basically, but mostly US. And GitHe is the Chinese version of the same thing, which is about 1/10 of the size. Now it looks like America want to control that and say China can't have access to open source because even though it's open source, China is abusing it and taking too much of it and then developing too quickly from it. Have I got that right? Or is there something I'm missing there? Don't forget to unmute.
Yes, you have. I'm no expert on it. I've messed with it, and I have worked with it in policy, and I've promoted it when I worked in the Malaysian government and in the Ministry of Education. And the issue arose of the tremendous investment in digital technology and in software in particular. Open source covers not just software, but hardware, and that's increasingly important, right? This, but software in particular, really low-hanging fruit, to try to drive that as I did, you find out how the entrenched interests will fight back very fiercely, and it really, I mean, there are certain things, for example, and you want to ask yourself, why kids were being taught. First of all, there's this problem of what it meant to have sort of digital education. But if you're going to teach them how to use kind of to do word processing or to use a spreadsheet, must it be someone's branded product? Does it have to be Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, and you pay the license and so on? So I mean, there are some things which are solved problems. There is software that's really quite simple, and there's no need for proprietary solutions. So, in developing countries, open source is it's a really kind of, it's a no-brainer not to be paying those licenses. But open source also means that you can, the code by definition is available to you, and developers can continue to work on it so long as they use that code, so long as they share the results of it to the extent that they use the code. But the US now trying to bar China from GitHub, this is just so absurd. You're at a loss for words.
Okay, I thought it was just me being obtuse here, but it's not.
No. I mean, it's just, but there are a bunch of these really, really dumb things. You're weaponizing the platforms of open collaboration. I mean, these are platforms which, by definition and by common agreement, are open. So, so of course, the big worry now and the big fear is what Huawei in particular, which has been frozen out of in its mobile phone business out of Android. Their apps are not just Android, but Apple as well, iOS. But so there was the weaponization of of your system software, which was always understood to be collaborative. Say Apple or Microsoft or whoever, Google might build Android. Android in particular, of course, is built on top of open source. But you have this, and people are invited to develop stuff on top of it, and it's collaborative, and a huge amount of social value is brought together there. And all of a sudden, of course, you exercise your monopolist right, and you say, all right, so and so is out of it. So Huawei got frozen out, and of course they've developed their own OS remarkably quickly, open source based. But this time, they're going to open it out completely, unlike Android. So this is really causing, some worry and some panic. So you want to freeze Huawei or Chinese companies out of open source, and similarly, the Chinese government and Chinese research institutions, any security sensitive stuff, they've begun to use open source. They've begun to use Linux operating systems, distributions that they have created themselves. Now, all of these are contributions. Harmony OS and Chinese developed versions or flavors of Linux, such as Open Kylin, they are contributed back to the community. That's the spirit of open source. There is just no way. It's inconceivable that you ban these people from it. And in fact, now, of course, the biggest donors of code are Chinese companies to the open source project. And it is now that the open source project, which always suffered from this reputation of being, or the problem that, well, it was the commons, right? And you had the tragedy of the commons, or even the looting of the commons. You're aware of that problem. So if everybody can use it for free, but who's going to contribute to it? So people were putting into it. In the beginning, you have had certain companies like Sun Microsystems in the past, right? Put into it. Oracle at one point, they'll say that they put into it, but nobody owns it. And the capitalists say, the neoliberals say, well, you'll always lose to proprietary software. But now you have Chinese companies doing this at scale. It is going beyond, your IP, the idea of open source as this kind of hobbyist thing, as a cottage industry that never quite sort of is able to take off. So, yeah, so this is the sort of battle going on now. I mean, I want to add that open source is by far, open source software, Linux, for example, is by far the dominant software. I mean, your internet architecture, your data centers and all that are run on Linux and open source software. But, when we had this discussion, Warwick had some great points about a great perspective on this, in that the whole proprietary software economy and is a rentier monopoly model economy. And you need to look beyond the software to look at the structure of the US economy as a whole and its dependence on this rentier model in software and software services. And that is under really serious threat from China's way of doing business, which is to put everything out there, make it really, really cheap, right? And do things at tremendous scale and efficiency and make money on the margin. So the real sort of free market types in this regard are the Chinese, or free market in Adam Smith's sense of severe competition and profits going down to zero.
So, Warwick, is this something that makes the United States administration even more uncomfortable?
Look, certainly makes the United States very uncomfortable. Open source has been also part and parcel of how firms are developing their own capabilities in chip designs with the RISC-V protocol, which is an open source design protocol. And that is enabling and supporting the development of a fast-tracked chip sector in China. Interestingly, I saw a report today that the breakdown of the Huawei Pura 70 phone indicates that the 7-nanometer chip in that phone is from TSMC. It is sourced domestically in China, which strongly suggests that Huawei and its supply chain partners have, in effect, broken the back of that particular barrier to a point where not only can they produce and implement the chip within a high-end smartphone, but that they are able to do it at scale and to do it reliably. So that's been a very interesting development in the last couple of weeks and reported on today. The transformation in the economic model is going to, so this is the issue of the rentier economy. The rents, or economic rents, is essentially a form of super profit or above average profit that is garnered by somebody on the basis of some privileged quasi-monopoly or monopoly rights to something, or that they have ownership over something that no one else can have. So typically when people think of rents, they think of ground rent, which is rents paid for land. And the rentier economy, when traditionally conceived, is the economy of feudal lords, where people paid feudal lords rents to be able to use their land to grow things on the land and those sorts of things. And the particular rents that are garnered come from the particular properties of individual parcels of land, whether they are more productive because they have a better topography or better soils, or they might have access to natural attributes such as running water, whereas an adjacent block of land doesn't. Those sorts of things. We also see rents garnered in environments where particular uses of land are bolstered by legal parameters. So in town planning environments where you have different land use permissions across a city, the relative value of different parcels of land is very much bound up with the use rights associated with those parcels of land and the limitations on those use rights from one person to another. So retail centre owners, for example, typically achieve a much greater value on a per square metre basis for a given parcel of land than other land uses within a city. In the arena of technology, we have rents accrued because of intellectual property rights. So the idea that a particular actor owns a unique something or another enables them to charge a fee for that, for the use of that, that is well and above the market average for particular services. And it's hard to imagine that whatever the annual license fee is for Microsoft or for accessing the iOS environment that you pay with an Apple phone, for example, that somehow that reflects marginal cost. It's inconceivable that marginal cost is that high. And as John mentioned, in an environment where you've got intense competition, the tendency is for profits to be squeezed as all suppliers take out margin with the aim of securing the sale. So the dynamics of intense competition is to squeeze profits out, and it also drives innovation as firms need to find new ways of realizing productivity to boost their profit margins back up. So in theory, there is a potential for competition to be partly virtuous in the way that it works. It can, of course, have very significant downside impacts if firms can't innovate in time or are overtaken by events or whatever. So I think we're starting to see a challenge to the American rentier economy in a few respects. One is a rentier economy based on the ownership of fictitious capital, which is your rights to future value garnered through things like shares and other financial instruments traded on public markets. And on the other hand, we've also got these revenue and profit rights that come with ownership of particular intellectual property. China's challenging both. De-dollarization is a challenge to the first one, and the expansion of open source with serious critical mass behind it now. And that's the big difference. Open source has been around a long time, and but it's the commercial heft that is now brought to the table that takes open source to another level. And both of these things are going to the heart of the American business model.
So given that open source is some person, some individual, or some corporation designs a software or a hardware, puts it on the market and says, this is open source, and then they register it as open source, how can then a government say, we're going to change the rules on that and make it not open source? How is that at all possible? Now, before we get into that, John, I'm conscious of the time. You've got to leave by 8 o'clock, right? John, you've muted yourself again.
Yeah, I got to leave about there. Yeah.
Okay. Just quickly, if you can answer that question, how is it possible for a government to say, we're going to change this open source rule and make sure that China doesn't have access to it? How is that possible? Or is it possible?
It's not. it's absolutely ludicrous. It's like saying, look, I mean, the idea behind open source is not it's not some wacky thing, they created by some guys at MIT. But it's not. The idea behind it is as old as culture itself. Culture is open source. right? Aristotle is open source. The Pythagorean theorem is open source. I don't have to pay anybody for it, right? And I can, I can work on it. But Mickey Mouse isn't open source. So you have the system of patents, for example, and of copyright, which is a monopoly assigned by the government as a matter of policy. And it's discretion. It's policy in order with the idea that this is going to spur. It's for the greater good. It's going to spur innovation, and therefore we grant this. We create this system in which we rig the market in favor of the person who we determine came up with the idea first. So you are creating a monopoly so that there are rents. Profits from monopoly positions are, in that sense, rents. So the idea behind open source is so much of what we do in software, in ideas, is building. It's part of culture, and it ought to be open and free. So you can't. It's like saying, all right, mathematics, you chinks can't work on it anymore, right? or language. You're not supposed to speak English anymore. At some point, somebody's going to say, well, you guys, too many of you learning English, right? You can't. It's getting to that level of absurdity. Of course, I'm saying practically, of course, they can. The way they're going to do it is freeze them out of GitHub, for example, which is a platform, right, for storing code and working on it and having versions of it and tracking it. So this is how people share stuff. But of course, the Chinese can build that, and they are, to go against it is as fundamental as, it's an abuse as fundamental as abusing your sovereign currency. In that this is a medium of cooperation, of open cooperation, which you thereafter take and say, oh no, this is mine. So it's almost as absurd as saying, look, you can't speak English anymore, you guys, right? So it's ludicrous, and I don't really give it much credit. So they're going to do it through specific tactical things like banning, Chinese firms from GitHub. I think you're going to have the open source community up in arms, a lot of it over this matter. There are particular open source projects such as Linux, which certain people have control over, right? Linus Torvalds, in the case of Linux, and a group of people, they might say, we need to branch it off in certain ways. But that code is out there, and then you can't go and sue Huawei and say, look, I have copyright, I have, intellectual property on this stuff. You don't. And if Huawei opens it up, then it's all hell breaks loose. So it's really structurally, in terms of the whole system of property rights around this, it's going to be we're in for really disruptive times as they try to break this. Conversely, on the other hand, I agree with, and Warwick makes a very good point. This is quite a fundamental challenge to the rentier economy of economy style of the US. And it goes back to the way in which these things are quite fundamental, building things and so on. It reminds me of that discussion we had. I go back to the discussion we had earlier on about the possibility of moving TSMC over into the United States. All you do is give it subsidies and it's going to work. It started to occur to me, to make it work, you needed an entire, it's, as they say, it takes a village to raise a child. You need an entire system to make this work. You cannot do this in a system, in an economy that's already a totally financialized economy, where your workers are being, don't have health care and so on. And it's just fundamentally wrong. It's just not, it's not going to be competitive. But of course, they're going to ram it through anyhow. So I think it's quite a disconcerting time to see them try to do this, and to see from the get-go, look, this TSMC stuff in Arizona, it's not going to work, because it takes more than just putting subsidies into it. In the end, it's about a society. An economy isn't just the firm, right? Isn't just the engineers. It's your whole system. It's your infrastructure, your logistics included, but also how you manage it's the political economy. And it's not accidental that these things work very well in Taiwan and in South Korea and in China, and not so well now after 30 years of kind of neoliberal kind of destruction of the manufacturing sector in the United States.
Right. Okay. So, do you need to leave us very soon? I don't want to push you away here, but you did say 8 o'clock. You have to be on a.
So
you're off.
apologies.
Yeah.
So
no, that's okay.
Yeah,
I appreciate you spending the time with us when I know that you're pretty busy and traveling as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to speak with you, and I'm sorry I'm going to miss the rest of this. All right.
Well, we'll stick around for a bit if that's all right with Warwick.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Well, thanks, John. And
okay. We'll miss you too, John. We'll miss you too.
Yeah, I'll watch it on. I'll turn it on YouTube while I do that stuff. So
later on.
Right. Good night, gentlemen.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So Warwick, let's moving with this. You mentioned last week that TSMC might be coming into China. Is that possible?
It's already in China.
But I mean, sorry, expanding more in China. Is it because surely the idea of this sanction thing is that they're going to have to get out, aren't they?
Get out. I'm not sure I said that, but maybe I did. Look, and
maybe I misunderstood,
and maybe it was also said in the spirit of provocation more than anything else. Look, just picking up on some of the points John mentioned around the open source stuff.
Okay.
First, because it will feed into this sort of more specific issue around particular activities. The way that the move will be made will I think, as John suggested, could involve trying to prohibit particular firms from accessing the platform. But the other way, of course, is simply to shut the platform down. Now, it wouldn't be the first time that the United States government has shut websites down. And now that would, I suspect, cause all hell to break loose within the software development community. So any moves against GitHub would have to be undertaken with great care in terms of the politics of that community. The interesting thing about the risks, if you will, is that this is another example of what I often describe as an autoimmune function response. So in the name of trying to protect the system, the actions taken tend to actually hurt the system more. So in this case, an attempt to protect the integrity of American software rentier economy privileges will actually undermine the rentier economy even more, because I suspect that it will do nothing more than catalyze a more intensive effort from people around the world who are involved in open source projects to make them a winner and to make them accessible and available as an alternative to the often incredibly expensive applications that come from those who control the monopoly rents. So I think that's one of the issues. Look, I think the TSMC question, I don't see it as a company moving to the mainland anytime soon. But it does raise interesting questions around, again, its experience in Tokyo, where it is successfully rolling out another plant, the problems it's having trying to get another couple of fabs up and running in Arizona, together with its obvious ongoing and historic successes on the island itself. And I think what we've got to really be thinking about when we address these things is not just one firm in itself, but as an isolated island, but what this ecosystem needs to be for enterprises like this to become successful. And one of the challenges that has been met head on by Chinese firms and the Chinese government in the face of the various chip war related prohibitions and constraints and limitations and bans and whatever else you want to call them, has been to commit a huge amount of resource to every aspect of this digitalized ecosystem in an effort to overcome the prohibitions from accessing this technology. And as I mentioned, 7 nanometer chips is now being produced uh, domestically in China. And the other thing, though, to also note is, I mean, so much energy gets put onto the latest and greatest, the 7 and the 5 nanometers, and even smaller.
Mm.
But what has often gone unremarked, though it has been picked up to some extent by parts of the mainstream press, is that Chinese productive output in more traditional chips, 28 nanometer and 14, and all those sorts of things, is actually growing, and and its market share is expanding globally, heading towards 39% from 30, low 30s, I think, from memory. And the fear, once again, is that Chinese manufacturing, in this case, in so-called legacy chips, is going to deliver incredibly low cost in a high volume category. Now, if that happened, and when that happens, the financial models of a lot of the existing incumbent manufacturers will be severely tested. Um, you know, are they in a position to respond with sharper pencils? I don't know. But
Or a better product.
well, with a lot of the legacy stuff, it's hard to
Mm.
get better because it's sort of
Right.
old and mature. So it's going to come down to productive efficiency. Now, the reason why it's a challenge is a lot of the firms that that are in this space depend upon these legacy product categories to be cash cows, to help finance your expensive R&D to create your new generation high tech stuff. Now, if
Mm.
those cash cows start getting eroded by intense competition from high volume manufacturers from China, uh, these firms are going to start to face serious problems at the R&D end as well. So I think this is another classic case of autoimmunity at work, a case of be careful what you wish for, because so many of these policy responses from the American administration has actually resulted in more self-harm than it has in terms of its stated objectives of holding back China and Chinese firms.
Wow. So we are in for difficult times in the chip manufacturing industry if we're not in China, it appears.
Look, it could well be, yeah.
Yeah, it seems to me to be what you said before, the autoimmune deficiency. They have literally made themselves unwell by trying to make themselves better. They've made themselves worse.
Yeah, and this sort of sense of lack of awareness about this is the piece that often bemuses me, or is the point of most intense curiosity. Because, and this goes back to that very first question you asked, which is what annoys America or the American administration. And I think one of the things that really annoys the American administration is that for reasons that it hasn't reflected a lot on, every initiative it's taken in the name of one thing has actually led to results that are anything but desirable from the point of view of the administration. Now, that's got to be incredibly annoying and incredibly frustrating. And I think you see that bubble over when, every time the Chinese tech sector announces or demonstrates that it's been able to overcome some bottleneck or some
Yet another objection from America. Yeah.
the reaction is to double down, right? Well, we've got to tighten it up. The fence has got to go higher, and the yard's got to go a little bit bigger. To borrow Jake Sullivan's analogy, he talked a lot about the high fence, small yard stuff. Well, they just keep making the fence higher and the yard bigger, because they're trying to cover more and more.
Okay, let's move off the techo stuff for a little while, because there's another before, because I don't want to subject our viewers and listeners to another 3 hours. We could chat all night. I know that because we've done it before. But I wanted to move on to Ukraine. You made a comment the other day about Ukraine. Ukraine is now, it's either a stalemate or it's an inevitable defeat for Ukraine, which means a victory for Russia. Does that make the Indo-Pacific more or less stable? Now, this is part of reimagining America because it's really both of these things are their ponds. They've created these conflicts, if you like. Are we in a great danger in the future?
Look, unfortunately, I think that what's playing out in Asia is very much a carbon copy of what has played out in Eastern Europe over the course of the last 20 years, and the patterns, I guess, of geopolitical strategy that have been employed over that period seem to be replicated in Asia, whether it's encroachment, if you will, to put spatial pressure on China. So this idea of containment that is taking place, or that has taken place in Asia and is intensifying of late around China, is strategically of a similar ilk to the eastward expansion of NATO. The deployment of missiles, around the your target other, whether it's Russia or China, creates intensified risks all round. And the United States has recently announced that it will be deploying medium-range missiles in and around the Western Pacific, specifically addressing China. The roping in of other countries as part of an alliance model, not only in terms of the expansion of NATO eastward, but de facto expansion of NATO historically, I think you start seeing played out with its own particular permutations in Southeast Asia as well, particularly in terms of the Philippines, and then Japan, and to some extent also Australia. The idea of mobilising allies within a geography to contribute to an effort to put pressure on a counterpart. Now, all of this has been done in the name of deterrence. You will recall that in the Ukraine context, as NATO expanded, the claim was always made that NATO is a defensive organisation and that the Russians have nothing to fear. John Mearsheimer has consistently said it's kind of irrelevant what NATO says about itself. If the Russians think that it's of grave concern, so much so that it represents an existential risk, then you really need to take those concerns very seriously. And but again, I think we're seeing in Asia a very similar mindset, which is all of these military intensifications around China in the name of deterrence is, this is a defensive move. There's nothing to worry about. And yet clearly China is, just like the Russians have done in the past, are making it very clear that these initiatives, if you will, are creating significant concerns for the security of the Chinese. So, you can just keep going through all of the things that was done in Ukraine, in and around Ukraine, the destabilization of Ukraine itself, the attempts to destabilize periphery countries, whether it was Georgia and more recently Armenia and those sorts of places. All of these have been subjected in one sense or another to so-called colour revolution moves. And I think the situation in Hong Kong has been clearly part of that kind of strategic or tactical manoeuvre, just as the ongoing attempts to stir up separatist groups in northwest China. I hear the rhetoric concerning Tibet, but or Xizang, which I don't think has really gained much traction globally for quite some time. Certainly not since Richard Gere's movie all those years ago. And but you can see the effort to destabilize China's peripheries,
Yeah.
the attempt to arm up a bunch of proxies, spatially impose yourself onto China. I mean, the 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 American military activities, as well as those of its allies through the South China Sea, have not been dissimilar to the ways in which the NATO forces used to fly through and over the Black Sea, basically pressing right on on Crimea in particular.
So,
and
yeah.
and
So it's a recurring pattern, and nothing much is changing.
there's a tactical pattern here. So I think we're going to see, for the time being, intensified instability in the region.
Right. So we're talking about reimagining America here. Is there an America? Is there an America in existence right now that hasn't yet come to the fore that might actually be for world peace? I know you sarcastically said they do everything for world peace, and they're bringing freedom and democracy with them at the barrel of a gun, of course, which I see is not very much of a democracy if you're forced to take it. Then you've got the other kind of democracy that they introduced, which is the paid-for democracy in Taiwan, in particular. And then you've got the other kind of democracy in India, which isn't a democracy at all, because unless you're a Hindu, then you don't really have much of an option of getting any representation. So we've got all these different kinds of democracies. But is there an America? Is there one that can come through where they are now to where we might have some kind of peaceful world?
Look, I think that there are plenty of Americans of goodwill who yearn for and speak out for a more peaceful and sensible American international or foreign policy.
Right.
There are certainly voices that have been very critical of America's historical addiction to military interventions, arguing for a greater commitment to statecraft as opposed to kinetic first reactions. There is a foreign policy tradition within the American political cultural history, a more Jacksonian posture, which is one that is a lot more concerned about the domestic affairs of state and the conditions of Americans in America than worrying about projecting America and its values, or however you want to see it, outwards. And if it's not its values, simply its view that America is secure only when it dominates the world, because then the world can't threaten America. So I think that there is a lot of potential in the American intellectual history, and also dotted throughout the American body politic, of people of goodwill who believe that there is a better way. The other challenge, and I think this is likely to be one that could drive changes to American elite attitudes to global affairs, actually comes from the domestic concerns of Americans and how the political elite are going to need to address those. And I'm speaking of the imbalances that are increasingly evident in the American social settlement, whereby again, I go back to the idea of the promises of America are not being fulfilled. The idea that Wall Street has gained substantially at the expense of Main Street, and ultimately leaving a whole bunch of people and a growing bunch of people living on Struggle Street. That's unfortunately the experiences of many people. 60% of Americans report that they're living paycheck to paycheck. 20% or so of American households have reported that they're skipping meals so that they can pay rent and mortgages. 12.8% of Americans, according to the United States Department of Agriculture, exist in a condition of food insecurity, that just don't have enough food. 93% of shares on the on the stock market in America are owned by less than 10% of Americans. So the concentration of wealth is incredible. So there's a whole bunch of imbalances that are in place. You know, there's a recent Senate report came out of the Senate in America, February report on the super profiting of big pharmaceutical companies at the expense of American healthcare. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that is screaming out that America can do a lot better by focusing the energies and efforts and mental acuity of its people towards resolving these contradictions and imbalances. And in doing so, it will actually become a more, hopefully, I think it can become a more peaceful place itself. Because the other thing we know is the incidence of mental illnesses is rising. The visitations to therapists is increasing, but it's not bringing down the incidence of mental illnesses. The opioid crisis is, beyond anything that you can imagine. And of course, worst of all, mass shootings is a distinctive and perpetual feature of American society. Now, none of that speaks to a place that is at peace with itself. And you've heard me say before that an America that's not at peace with itself will never be at peace with the rest of the world. And I mean that because I think America has the potential to tackle these issues and come to grips with the imbalances that exist within its structure. And by doing so, will create a better America, fulfill the objectives of creating a better union, and at the same time, in doing so, actually be a much better America as a member of the global citizenry.
One of the things that I like, and I've spoken to, I had a series of videos with MAGA communists, and I've spoken to a few of them, and privately through lots of DMs, getting lots of feedback from them. And this surprised me a lot about America, the what I would call the extreme left and the extreme right having the same ideas. And they're basically socialists without realizing they were socialists, because it's a bit of a bad word being a socialist in America, or being a communist. It's not a nice word to be called that. And they're finding themselves in this very strange dichotomy where they cannot believe anything that they're reading in the media, and yet they want to believe that China is bad. I actually just wrote an article, and this is for Britain, not for America, but the same thing. It was the Workers' Party of Great Britain asking for an article about socialism in China, even though China isn't very socialist because of what it does in Hong Kong and what it does in Xinjiang. It can't. This is people who should know better. And basically, they're reading their media and saying, I can't believe a thing except China. I can believe everything in China. And I think Southside Mike, the same guy from the first question we put up, made a comment, said, not everyone reads this. A lot of people see through the bullshit. And I hope what you said before, there's a lot of very good Americans, and I'm finding that through my interactions with these people that, I'll be quite honest, until a few weeks ago, I would have steered away from. MAGA communism? No, I don't want to be part of that. Now I'm finding I'm warming to these people, and there are a lot of good Americans. And I think maybe that's the future. A socialist America, do you think that's possible?
Well, so long as it's not called a socialist America, I think that there's
Correct.
But you can see what the conditions are that actually gives rise to these shared concerns on the various dimensions of the political spectrum, and these are concerns that very much on the issues that I articulated, which is an America that is hollowed out, that is financialized, where Wall Street has done extremely well at the expense of Main Street, and these are real concerns. You're not making this stuff up. Now, how one then analyzes that and comes to a view as to what to do about it, I guess, is what gives rise to differences in policy approach and priorities. But the fact is that there are shared concerns that stem from the reality of the political economy of America and the imbalances in its social settlement. You
Hmm.
can't have a functional society when healthcare costs prohibit a large proportion of people getting access to healthcare. You can't have a functional society where um, most of the wealth is increasingly concentrated in the hands of not just the top 10%, but the top 1%. A rentier economy is not an economy that brings the vast majority of people along with it. Now, this
Mm.
was the point about capitalism overthrowing feudalism, so to speak, was the idea of overcoming an economy that was premised on rents. The idea that you
Mm.
had these landlords, controlling the sources of wealth and resources by dint of birth, um, you know, being the way in which you organised a contemporary society. That doesn't work, and people are angry, and people are disappointed, and I think that the message that needs to perhaps get through, if you will, is that the commitment to the military industrial complex is something that is actually at odds with the interests of the majority of Americans. It
Mm.
doesn't make America any more secure. I mean, for crying out loud, geography and relatively benign neighbors, north and south, and the fact that it's got one of the biggest economies in the world makes it America incredibly secure.
Yeah.
America becomes more secure when more people are doing better, when people get access to affordable healthcare, decent education, when wealth inequalities aren't as great as they are, when there's a much reduced incidence of gun violence, etc., etc. Now that's a better America, and
When did America change to become? Because I grew up in the 1960s, and I used to covet things like I had crew cut because I wanted to look like an American. I remember telling my mum when I was 7 or 8 years old, I want a crew cut. And I used to have baseball boots, which now we call Converse All Stars or whatever they call now. Things that were American. I loved them as a kid growing up because America it was a beacon. It was a place we were. I mean, I was born in '58, so it's not quite post-war, but still quite an austere society where there wasn't a lot of there wasn't a lot of there was freedom, but there was not a lot of money to spend on things. Our local holidays at the time were, we'd drive 2 hours to the beach and stay in a caravan. We lived in a beach and we could have had caravans in our front yard, but we drove somewhere 2 hours away and stayed in a caravan. And then as we got more affluent, when I was in my early teens, we started to take trips to France, things like that. So we grew up in a place that absolutely loved what America was becoming. What happened and when or how did this happen? And could America go back to what it was?
um, I think it's very hard for places to go back. But I think that there was a confluence of things that came together somewhere in the uh, early to mid 1970s that really
Mm.
catalyzed a very substantial change. As you mentioned, in the years immediately after the war, the American economy was one of the last left standing. And in fact, the
Yeah.
American economy delivered over 50% of global GDP from memory in the years after the Second World War. So it was a very dominant manufacturing powerhouse, and the 1950s saw the emergence of the the classic mass consumer market as American households began to get wealthier and those sorts of things. Interestingly, during the 1960s in particular, the United States embarked on some very grand domestic and uh, global ambitions, which I think started to put a lot of pressure on its economy, which then led to the problems that we started to see in the 1970s. So,
Mm.
the United States embarked on a very ambitious social program, the Great Society program. Incredibly expensive, but it was a grand vision. It was involved in preparing to. It had a massively expensive space program, so I was going to send someone to the moon at some point. It was also engaged in an arms war with the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And so it had big, and it also then got involved in that period in some very expensive and very hard to get out of wars in Asia, the Vietnam War in particular, but also the Korean War. So all of these commitments from the 1950s through to the 1960s placed incredible burdens on the American economy. Come the latter half of the 1960s, the American economy actually began a slow process of deindustrialization, or at least outsourcing a lot of its manufacturing. It was already starting to happen. And when you read the academic literature and some of the policy literature of the time, come the 1970s, there were already concerns that the United States was stripping itself of its manufacturing capability.
Yeah.
Now, come the early 1970s, these financial pressures began to catch up on the US economy, so much so that there were concerns that the US actually, so it had been financing these by issuing more money, right, as debt. So it was already starting to increase its public debt to finance these activities. And other countries, the Dutch and the French from memory, actually became very concerned in the early 1970s that the Americans weren't actually good for the gold that at that point in time backed the US dollar. Yeah. And legend has it that the French sent a battleship to New York Harbor with the aim of collecting its gold from the vault. The upshot of all of this was President Nixon announcing the temporary suspension of the gold standard. So what had been in place since the end of the Second World War, which was pegging the US dollar to gold priced at $35 an ounce, was suspended, and that the US would not redeem claims upon its gold when people came to it with US dollar notes. That was a temporary suspension. Now, that was 50 odd years ago now, right? 51, 52 years ago. And the temporary is still very temporary, permanent. Not long after that, the deal was done with the House of Saud, Saudi Arabia, to exchange security in effect for the Saudis accepting only US dollars for oil. And we saw the petrodollar in effect replace the gold standard. But all of these dynamics, I think, to answer your question, underpinned or catalyzed the structural transformation of the American economy from what was a manufacturing powerhouse in the 50s and 60s to one that began to hollow out in the 1970s. And insofar as hollowing out was concerned, and insofar as the expansion of the financialized sectors of the economy, whether it's real estate, whether it's stocks and shares, and those sorts of things, that really took off from the early 1980s onwards, and financialization has never looked back.
Yeah, it seems to me to have been sometime around the Kennedy assassination. Maybe that's what was the catalyst to it. But it seemed like everything was going great. And then it took a couple of years to suddenly turn around until 73. I think Reaganomics was the thing, the petrodollar. That seemed to be the kind of cut, the final cut that started the decline where we are now. Now, many people and many economists would argue with me that that's not true. It's the richest country in the world and so on. But we've talked about all of those social ills that they have. How do they recover from mass drug addiction, mass homelessness, mass poverty, increasing poverty as well. How do they change the system of their healthcare, which is causing people to die a lot younger than they used to? John Ross, the economist, says this is the biggest and best indicator of any economy. If your life expectancy is increasing, then you have a good economy. It doesn't matter what people say about you. If it's increasing, it's a good economy. So therefore, if it's decreasing, something is wrong with your economy, and theirs is decreasing. It took a big dive during COVID, of course, but I think that was a management issue rather than a health issue. It did kill a lot of people, but it ought not to have done had they done things differently. So how do they change it?
Look, I'd add one more thing to John's observations about the health indicator, and that is rising infant mortalities. Because there's two things. If you can't keep your if you can't keep your older people alive longer, leading better lives, that's one piece of a civilized society. But a functional society is one that has your next generation of taxpayers alive and healthy as they get older. So both of those are significant indicators. Look, there are substantial structural issues, Jerry, because much of the wealth that has emerged over the last 30 years has actually been on the back of asset value inflation. Right? So it's typically around assets that has been monetized, particularly on the share market, but it hasn't materialized in terms of the take-home wages of the vast majority of Americans. Their cost of living today is substantially worse off than it was a few years ago. Again, I saw a House of Representatives report, or it might have been from the Senate. I just can't remember offhand now. That was released about 2 years ago, which showed that Americans, actually released last year, that showed Americans today are having to spend about $11,000 more than they did 4 years ago to maintain the same quality of life in basic material terms. But, so there are some real issues. I mean, the other issue is how inflation, as I was touching on then, plays out as far as it affects people's livelihoods and their quality of life. And a recent paper published by former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers and some of his co-authors actually argue that if inflation numbers today were measured in the same way as the government used to, and that would include taking into account the cost of house repayments and other debt repayments, that inflation today is actually about 18%. And you're starting to see that play out in rising delinquencies. The information that I went through before in terms of households skipping meals to be able to pay debts and those kinds of things. So,
right.
Massive issues, Jerry. Unless people are willing to confront some of these structural imbalances, these are going to be almost immovable problems for the foreseeable future.
Is there a solution other than a war then? Because that does look like that's the only solution America could come up with, is we need to have a war that will just change the world order a little bit and leave us on top.
Well, trying to forestall the changes to what's happening globally, I think, is the objective. A war is devastating for all concerned. Unfortunately, I think there are some, not necessarily everyone in the American political blob, who believe that a war is what today's state is and that it must be won. So there was an article in, I think it's Foreign Affairs magazine, by a former Trump advisor, Pottinger, and an outgoing Congressman, Gallagher, which actually says, look, this isn't That's it. This isn't about competition. This is about a war that must be won.
Yeah.
And that's as I said, I don't think that is representative of the majority view of
I hope not.
American political elite, but it certainly is a point of view that has the potential to garner more and more support. And I say that because the tendency has been in the US political community for the most extreme neocon warmongering position to ultimately prevail. So whenever something's not going right, the advocates of doubling down initially are sort of dismissed as being a little bit on the edge and a bit over the top. But not long later, their views are adopted. And when those policies don't succeed, we go through this cycle again. And it's a cycle of intensification, and getting closer and closer all the time to initiating not just proxy wars, but participating directly in wars themselves.
Mm.
The saving grace on all of that, Jerry, at this point in time is that wars do take two to tango, and I'm not convinced that the that the targets of this next war, particularly China, are willing to take the bait.
I think you're right. A lot of people have asked me this question. Do you think China and America are destined for war? The simple answer is no. America is not. America will use proxies rather than go to war themselves. And the secondary answer is that exactly what you just said, it takes two to tango. And China is very much the restrained, the patient, the adult, the mature one in the room. So I think that they have read Sun Tzu's Art of War, and they know what the war will bring, and they know what they need to do to avoid it. But I've been asked about the possibility of a false flag. So what happens when either China is attacked and it looks like China did it, or somebody else is attacked and it looks like China did it, and you're going to get this situation. And I see a false flag as being one which will be an immediate reaction by somebody and then a step back by China. They will just step back and say, well, hang on a second, what makes you think that was us? And then the negotiations can come through. I think China will not respond in the way that Russia did, for example, to what they needed to do or what they felt they needed to do. China are not going to be that bombastic or belligerent.
Yeah, look, geography I think plays a role too, and what happens in the maritime environment is also quite different to what happens in a terrestrial environment. So,
True.
with Ukraine, for instance, pressing in, or NATO pressing in via the continental space, it is quite different in terms of how things play out. But look, I think that the general proposition always is that not only is it a question of does it take two to tango, which it does, I think that there is something broader at work, and perhaps the policymakers in China also appreciate this, and that is that what's going on in the world at the moment actually isn't just a dance between two. What's going on in the world is actually a system change from a unipolar system to a multipolar system. And a multipolar system, by definition, is not one where a new unipole replaces an old unipole.
Right.
So this is not a Thucydides trap proposition. The Americans might view it that way, that China is going to replace them, but I'm not convinced that the Chinese view it that way. And increasingly, I think we're starting to see the voices from the global majority and countries in the BRICS who actually see it very clearly as system change as opposed to merely a changing of the guard. So and I remember in our last conversation, I talked about, I think, the idea that it's incumbent upon not only China, but the other countries within the global majority to literally see the change through.
Yeah.
And that will require a willingness to bite the tongue, I think is the saying, and sometimes turn the other cheek to the extent that you can, so that you can just see this through.
Right. Kishore Mahbubani said it very well. China is not up against America. They don't want that leadership role. And I think also Ding Yifan last week said a great thing when he said he talks to leaders of the underdeveloped countries and they say, why won't China take up the role? It's because they don't want that role. They want the multipolar. They don't want a uni or even a bipolar or a tripolar, because you'd have Russia, China, and that's really the way that the Americans don't seem to see this. The 80, I think Kishore said it was 88%. I think it's probably a little bit less than that. About 82% of the world are already leaning towards the China camp, but China's not forcing them into a decision, stay with us and screw America, whereas America would force them into that position if they could.
Yeah, look, I think it is often unfortunate that the choices are pitched as one country or another, when I think that, in fact, as I was sort of alluding to, we're going through a process of system change, and the choices, if you will, is whether or not one participates in a process of trying to hold back system change, or participate in shaping that system change so that it happens with as little disruption and as quickly as possible. And that's the question. So, for instance, if you look in the Asia arena, if it is the case that American unipolarity and American primacy in Asia is a thing of the past, and I think by and large most observers would conclude that that is the case, including, I might add, from an Australian point of view, the Australian official position, which is that that American primacy is no longer the case in Asia. Then we actually do have a multipolar environment that has been given birth to, but one that has not yet taken full form. And and the real question is, how do the actors within this region, for example, contribute to a process in which multipolarity can take full form in this region? What does that look like? What are the pieces and the resources that are available in this region that enables a culturally and historically sensitive multipolarity to be created and sustained in this part of the world? How does ASEAN centrality actually become a significant and ongoing cornerstone of peace within the region, as opposed to efforts made to contain countries or to reassert primacy? That they seem to me to actually be more like the kinds of choices that make sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on in this region that don't get reported in mainstream media. These Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, things like that, the RCEP. We don't see very much of that. You do in Australian media because Australia is in it, but there's a lot going on. Fernando's just put up a question here. We're going back to the reimagining of America here. What role did the drugs and the war on drugs play in the derailing of the US as a country? What do you think about that for a question?
Yeah, that's that's a great curveball, actually.
It is, isn't it?
Well,
we are talking about reimagining America, and this is possibly the biggest thing. In my opinion, it's probably the biggest thing that has caused America's, if we're talking about the reality, it's a downfall.
Look, opioid addiction is clearly a major problem afflicting American society. I think that, that goes without saying. The images that you see on the news and on social media are harrowing and very disturbing, and it speaks of, again, this idea of this social settlement that is no longer working in the way that you would actually hope. So there is no doubt that drugs has played a big role in derailing the US as a country. Though I think it's important to also reflect on the cause and effect arrow directions as well, because perhaps it was a country that was derailing that gave rise to the conditions that made the opioid crisis possible. It's not
That's interesting.
It's not something that I'm overly expert in, so I'll just throw that out there really as a question for your viewers and your community to maybe reflect upon and share their wisdom on it. The war on drugs, however, has a number of very interesting dimensions. Firstly, it goes to the relationship between North America and the countries south of it in particular. And as we know, those relationships have been historically fraught. The US, of course, has had its wars with Mexico, but it's also played very active roles in destabilizing many of the countries of Central and South America over the last 6 or 7 decades. Not always ultimately to, in the interests of North America. I guess this is the problem with unintended consequences when you go in and destabilize and generate regime change. In the end, the new regime might fight you harder than the old one. The other point about the war on drugs is that it's been a very dominant part of, again, the rhetoric of politicians confronted with this issue, but it hasn't worked. It just hasn't worked. And the more that's spent on the war on drugs, the worse the situation seems to have become. And this goes to, I guess, again, this broader observation of mine, which is this question of autoimmunity response. If something's not working, or worse than that, it's actually doing you harm, why is it that the political elite insist on just doubling up? Why? I don't know. But certainly drugs is either a symptom or a cause or both of a country.
This one's a great comment, I think, because so many people believe. Now, I don't know if this is true or not. I've never lived in America. I've never really looked deeply into the DEA or the CIA, but so many people believe that the drugs in America are effectively being controlled by organizations like the CIA and the DEA. Of course, China's getting blamed at the moment for this opioid crisis, which has got nothing at all to do with China. And really, China has helped the DEA enormously, and that didn't make it into the Western media either. So do you think this is an internal problem that these elites are deliberately doing?
I don't know enough about it, to be honest, Jerry. Look, I'd be interested to hear what people have got to say. But again, I think that there is a more general observation rather than a specific one about that particular point, and that is the ability of the American political institutions to own their problems. And it seems that the pattern is to firstly try and deflect and blame others, and that's actually a very unfortunate approach to addressing real social and economic problems. You've got to be upfront with yourself, and when you are, and you can be upfront with the people, then you've got a good chance of actually framing solutions that people are willing to accept, even if they may involve short-term disruptions or pain.
Yeah, one thing is for certain. There's a couple of comments coming up here about Afghanistan. One thing is for certain, that the Taliban has destroyed more opium fields, more poppy fields than the CIA and the United States ever did during their 20-year administration. So that actually is a fact now. I wrote an article about that recently. There was a US economist stating that it was very, very bad for Afghanistan to hurt their economy so much because they're destroying these poppy fields. And as if that's something, what they've done now is they've kept a certain number of fields open to provide legally required controlled substances for the medical industry, but they've literally destroyed, and they're now providing alternate. Apparently, the pistachios and things like this are great from that region. So farmers are now getting opportunities to grow things that certainly they're selling a lot to China. And China is doing a lot of business now agriculturally, whereas they didn't before. There was nothing to buy agriculturally from Afghanistan, and now there is. So that's one thing. Maybe the CIA are out of business in Afghanistan, and that's why the opioid crisis has become so big. There's no heroin left there.
Well, one can only hope, and one can hope that some decent, stabilized economic development across that region will one, improve the quality of life of people there, and two, as a result of doing that, stabilize the sort of social political environment in that next.
Let's hope so. Yeah. Well, we're coming up towards 2 hours. Should we call it a night there? You're getting towards 11 o'clock, right?
11. Look, I'm happy to go till 2 hours, and then we'll call it quits if you got one more question from somebody. Otherwise,
all right. Let's see if we can get. I'm trying to stay away. There's a lot of questions coming, or a lot of points coming in here about blacks and males and females, and we got the war on drugs there, which we've covered. I think certainly in the last little period of time, we've covered pretty much everything. The war on drugs is still there.
What I might do is try and, in a sense, pull some threads together, if I may. And I guess these have been things that I've been thinking about and talking to people for a long time on. And I think that, and these are quite, how should we say, quite challenging as far as what they portend in terms of the short-term and medium-term futures are concerned. Right. But I think what's going on is the intersection of at least three main dynamics, and in no particular order. The first one is this broad structural change that's taking place in the economic makeup of the global economy. So we're shifting from a world or an economic system in which the United States was the single organizing pivot around which everything else took place, feeding ultimately from the peripheries into the center, to an economic structure that is far more decentered. And that's having some very significant effects on the way in which the United States interacts with that environment. And we're seeing that bubble over in terms of things like overcapacity and all of that. But put aside the political rhetoric, the structural interconnections between the US political economy and the global model actually takes place via the way that the US has financed its trade deficits, and that is through the issuance of American treasury bonds, through which and the expansion of the stock market, which are the two main mechanisms by which surplus countries have been able to recycle US dollars into the American economy.
Yeah,
that's the first thing that's happened. Now, the intersection of the global economic dynamics and the American political economy is actually this pivot of the stock exchange and the bonds market. These two fictitious capital markets have supported the dramatic concentration of wealth, particularly via asset price inflation over the last 30 years, at the expense of capital being committed to, let's call it, the real economy. And consequently, the domestic social settlement has become destabilized and unbalanced. So all of those social indicators that I talked about before are heavily related to the uh, the, the lack of real material improvement in the quality of life of people, whilst a very small sliver of American society has benefited a great deal from financialization. Wrapped around all of this is a culture or an ethos of American exceptionalism, which reflects internationally in terms of a belief that it is America's duty and a right to intervene around the world to transform others in its own image. And domestically, it manifests itself as the promise of the light on the hill. When that promise actually starts to become disconnected from the reality of lived experience, we start to see problems domestically insofar as political anger. So much so, Jerry, that there's actually scholarship which is seriously discussing the risks and the prospects of another civil war. So this
Right.
is serious stuff. Internationally, of course, as the structure of the international economy is changing, that's reverberating through geopolitical power, and the decentering of the United States is something that does not mesh well with a millenarian zealotry that says America is the indispensable, exceptional country. So these are the three dynamics that I think are at play. If you can think of it almost like a helix, where they interweave and work with and through each other, and it's these three things that are underpinning this period of dramatic change, this the biggest changes in the last 100 years, and which is also making the instabilities that we are witnessing very difficult things to keep in check at this point in time. So
Okay,
that's my
one last question, which is coming, which I think we probably should have covered: the TikTok ban. Do you think that the TikTok ban is a genuine national security concern, or is this a pure keep China down, maybe racism, but probably hegemonic problem? What do you think? We're calling it the TikTok ban, even though that's not its real name, but it seems to be the local colloquialism for it. What do you think?
It looks a lot more like a commercial rape and pillage to me. When you've got folk associated close to the political elite trying to raise money to buy TikTok.
Yeah.
Look, it's hard to believe that TikTok, the way it is, actually represents a national security risk. It's the idea that the ownership structure lends itself to being a risk. It's kind of undermined by the fact that there are substantial, and I think the majority of the shareholders are actually Americans and American funds and all of that.
Yeah, there's already checks and balances in place. We don't need to have any more.
But the other thing I think that is probably interesting here, apart from it being a sort of a corporate raid, is that it speaks to an American political system that, in effect, is saying that it doesn't have confidence in its own ability to regulate technology companies. And now I'm frankly very surprised by that when you see countries all around the world, and most recently India, introducing regulations that will impact the way that that Meta operates WhatsApp, for example. Countries are not shying away from regulating technology companies, and particularly in terms of data privacy, data security, data sovereignty, and those sorts of things. And when a Congress says, well, you either sell it or we're going to ban you, that basically says they don't think they can regulate this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't give, I wouldn't have thought that it gives Americans a lot of confidence in all of this. So I think that that's probably, to me, the most interesting thing. Look, it's an expression of a lot of anxiety and anger and frustration more than anything else. Um, it's a bit sad to see. It really is. It's just a bit
It,
sad.
it it definitely seems to me like it's a censorship issue. They can censor what they can control, and they can't censor what they can't control. And TikTok is not allowing them to control. So I see it as that. It's purely and simply a censorship issue. And the fact is, most Americans think they have freedom of speech, and now, certainly on campuses around America, they're finding they don't. They never did. Back in the 1960s, it was segregation causing these things. In the 1970s, it was the Vietnam War causing it. In the 2000s, it was Black Lives Matters and things like that. We've got all kinds of different things where America can control the narrative, but it seems like with TikTok, they can't. So I see it not so much as a regulation issue, but as a censorship issue. That's my view on that.
Look, censorship is an execution problem, right?
Mm.
How do you prevent certain things? And there's actually no technical or regulatory reason why they couldn't cause controls around the content on TikTok in much ways as other countries are able to manage and control content elsewhere as well. But look, it's an unfortunate expression of a period in time where the American political elite feel incredibly uneasy. That first question you asked, what annoys them or what makes them uneasy, and the presence of a successful Chinese technology platform company in America makes them uneasy. It's an easy target. It's an election year, and it's probably right. It's all of these things.
The point that Mike makes there is interesting, that Biden has said that he and his team will continue to use TikTok. I guess they're not afraid of security.
Look,
what about
it just speaks to the hypocrisy, right? I mean, often people make a lot of American hypocrisy. These days, I probably tend less so, but not because the hypocrisy is any less or worse, or not as bad, but simply because it's just such a prevalent feature of show roles.
Yeah. Fernando's asked me a question. I did see it come up ages ago, and I've got two things going here. If you see me doing, I'm actually talking with people on WeChat at the same time as I'm talking to you. Does AI, artificial intelligence, does it have a role in reinventing the USA? I don't see how it could not have a role, but how do you see it?
Well, whatever's going to happen with AI, it's going to have a big impact. I'm not convinced that this current phase of AI, particularly with large language models, is anything more than mimicry on steroids. But the mere fact that it's on steroids means that it can compute very, very quickly, and speed does have its own qualities in terms of what it can cause to happen in societies and economies. But look, there's a long way to play out in all of this stuff. I mean, it's not the first time we've had great promises around AI. We had great promises in the 1950s around AI, and we've had great promises that somehow we're going to achieve through computers some kind of general intelligence that will ultimately, surpass human intelligence. Well,
yeah. I wonder if Joe Biden ever comes into work in the morning, sits down at the Oval Office desk and opens his laptop and says to ChatGPT, how should I manage the country today? Do you think that would work? I mean, ChatGPT may say, well, you've got to get out of Israel. You've got to do this. You've got to pull out of Ukraine, and you've got to stop threatening Taiwan and China. And if you do all of those things, we'll have a really peaceful world. It could be the perfect solution.
Well, it just depends on what the learning database is that his version of ChatGPT.
That's also true. Yeah. This is the thing. It's not intelligent. It's pre-programmed.
This is what we mean when we say mimicry. It has a rubbish
mimicry on steroids is a good way.
And it has a compounding problem because it obviously keeps feeding into itself, which means that it literally can compound its own errors.
Mm.
That's how
Okay,
it is.
so here's the final question to finish the show. Will the US eventually succeed in its attempt? I can answer this in one word, but I'll let you go with this one.
Look, I'm going to guess your answer was no. Look, and look, there's lots of reasons for it, but the critical mass that has been built up in a place that has 1.4 billion people, that has connections, and well, that is in fact the largest trading partner of 130 odd countries in the world. That is now the world's largest development finance provider. Is the idea of containment is just a nonsense, and this is going to be another example, I think, of autoimmunity at work. Because what this will actually do is hasten the dynamics driving system decentering.
As we've had so many new people coming in and going out, I would like you, just before we finish, to give me your definition, because I think this is brilliant. This is possibly one of the most brilliant analyses of the United States. Explain what your autoimmune deficiency means to our viewers.
Yeah, autoimmunity is a reaction to something in a system by the system that is an immune response. So it then starts to attack whatever it is that it believes is threatening it. But often what happens with autoimmune reactions is not only does it attack the bad things or what it thinks are the bad things, it actually starts attacking the good things. So it begins to undermine itself and destroy itself from the inside. And it comes from biology, really, I guess. And I think that there is something systemic about the way that a lot of the collective West and the Americans are currently responding to the changing world around them. That is a response that says we are going to do X in the name of protecting whatever it is that we value. But the more of X that they do, the more damage they do to the things that they value. And examples include the way that they're dealing with information, for example. So, you touched on this question of censorship. When you run a political system for years on this idea of freedom of speech, unconditional freedom of speech, and yet at some point in time you start to impose conditions on it in the name of protecting freedom of speech, well, you've got a problem. It sort of doesn't work. You can't square that circle. Now, I actually don't think you can run I actually don't think there is any such thing as unconditional freedom of speech anyway. But we can have that as a very different discussion, and that's not a normative. That's not a normative judgment at this point in time. It's simply saying that there is actually no such thing as unconditional freedom of speech. And the second thing is that almost all societies and governments ultimately have a point in which they think that there is something within the system that threatens it, and they will often suspend the things that they value in their system as the first step to tackling whatever it is that they think is a threat. So suspending freedom of speech, suspending freedom of association, beating up on the students on campuses, all those sorts of things, in the name of protecting a society that values these things, is partly an autoimmune.
You saw they arrested a presidential candidate as well. Jill Stein got arrested.
There's something like incredibly disproportionate about all of this stuff. And again, often hard to understand, what causes a system to react so violently when it was hard to see that these gatherings of students and academics and others posed any substantial risk to social stability. It was very it was just a very odd thing.
It does. I've written an article about it. Hasn't been published yet. I'm not sure if it will be, but I wrote an article about it. With basically, one of the issues with this is that this is happening on private property, and that's the reason the police are called in. If it was happening in the street, it would be a different matter. But on private property, on the campus, the university can call in the police, and then the police are obliged to, because this is not a crime, this is a trespass, it's a civil matter. The same thing happens in the UK. If Oxford University were to have this go on, if there's damage, that's a different thing, there's criminal damage. But if they're not doing anything other than obstructing the free passage in the street, the police can act. In a private area, they can't, unless they're invited in to act. So it looks to me like it's the universities that are really the problem. The bastions of free speech and the bastions of academic liberty are saying, we're not interested in doing this. And it's probably a lot of these are funded by the Israeli, it's not IPEC, but the Israeli funds are coming into them.
Well, but that's another classic example, right, of autoimmunity at work. And but the bit that I guess I'm always a little bit bemused by is the heavy-handedness of the policing tactics. I mean, you were in the force, right? I mean, the idea of throwing an unarmed, middle-aged, unfit person on the ground and having 3 pretty big men dive on top of them, twist their arms behind their back to slap some cuffs on them seems, pretty heavy-handed to me.
I can't say I've ever done that. I've been in Brixton, I've been in Lewisham, I've been at the Grunwick's disputes and the miners' strike. I was through all of those things. And a lot of people got arrested, but that kind of behavior, you're right, it's very, and these guys are all armed to the teeth. They've got tasers, they've got batons, they've got guns, and then there's the guys, and this tells me something. There's guys standing there in the background with a handful of cable ties, and you can see. Now, why would you need them if you're not planning to arrest? Rather than, yes, you can have your handcuffs and things. We did. But if somebody had been planning to arrest thousands of people or hundreds of people, there would have needed to have been some capacity to do so. And that's why you've got guys. And you see them coming into the video when someone gets taken down, a guy comes walking along and he's got 20 or 30 cable tie cuffs. I don't know what you call those things. We never had them, but cable tie cuffs. And he's got them all set up and ready to go, so they can just zip them on, and you're away. You're now trapped inside of this cable tied situation. Why are they prepared for that before they even go into this? They must know they're going to do this.
Look, perhaps I can just use this as a segue to wrap up for tonight, and that is to simply say that the images that have been conjured up through these episodes are not the kinds of images that you have when you're trying to imagine another America.
That's a very, very good way to finish that off. Yes, thank you. So we've had 2 hours and 12 minutes. We've had well over 150 people coming in, some fantastic questions. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the audience. And Warwick, thank you. And I know John will catch up later. Thank you, John, for joining us on a day that you had to travel. But let's wrap it up there, as it is getting late. In the real world, it's 9:15 here. It's 11:15 where Warwick is. And wherever you are, have a great rest of the day. And Warwick, thank you very much for your time. One last question, and it can be a yes or no answer. Should we make this a regular thing?
I'm happy to, if you'd like and your viewers would like.
I've had a couple of questions come in there. Can you do this more regularly? So I think this is our 3rd or 4th chat. I think we should probably start thinking about putting this down as a regular thing, because we have a lot to talk about. Sure. All right, everybody.
Work something out.